Welcome, everybody. We're just giving the attendees list a chance to stabilize, and then we'll start. Fantastic. Let's go. Hello, everybody. My name is Tuesday Raytano, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And I am both delighted and privileged to be here with Professor Mark Galliotti, Director of MIAC Intelligence and a member of our expert network of experts, Senior Advisor to our Observatory on the Ukraine conflict, and author of our latest report to launch, his magnum opus, or we like to call every work of Mark, honestly, his magnum opus, which is Gangsters at War, Russia's use of organized crime as a form of statecraft. We are really, really excited to share with you this piece of research, which is an insight into the way that Russia's strategic use of different forms of criminality are being enabled to support their war against the West. It falls for us within two bodies of work, obviously the Observatory of the Ukraine conflict, which looks not only at how organized crime is evolving in the immediate theater of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, but also its wider ramifications across the world. If you are interested in that observatory, you can find more information online. We've published over 24 reports since the invasion in 2022. And it is also part of a new body of work for the GI, which is of increasing prominence and importance, which is on what we are calling geocriminality, or states' instrumentalization, states' use and direction of organized crime for foreign policy purposes. No one is going to give you a better explanation of why that report is important and why that issue is important than Mark. So I will not steal any more of his spotlight, and I will pass the floor over. Mark, it is extraordinary pleasure to give you the floor.
Super. Well, thanks very much indeed. Delighted to be here. Delighted to be able to finally present this report, which has sort of occupied a slightly unfortunate amount of my time over the past few months. And just to give it a sort of very brief context before I open up my PowerPoint, the inevitable PowerPoint, and actually sort of present the report, I just want to pick up on Tuesday's point about geocriminality, that I think absolutely is one of these areas where, you know, we've been aware of it for some time in relation to specific threat actors, North Korea with its Bureau 39, Iran, Revolutionary Guard, essentially engaging itself with heroin trafficking and other activities in order to raise operational funds. And I think what we are seeing now is not just it as a much more sort of clearly emerging thing, taking fullest advantage of the opportunities created by globalization and an increasingly fractured global order, but also the degree to which actually we are seeing countries increasingly learning off each other. And I think in this context, you know, if one looks, for example, at the sort of increasingly close relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang, that for me is, and I'll touch on this right at the end of my presentation, something that we need to be aware of is about much more than just artillery shells and maybe now soldiers on the front line. Anyway, let me now test the limits of my technological competence and try and share my screen. And I trust that someone will shriek at me if for any reason I am not able to play my PowerPoint. So hopefully you'll now see the cover. So Gangsters at War. Yes, I mean, obviously it's sort of a nicely sort of shrieking title, but this is a really emerging threat. If we just simply look at some of the cases just this year, I mean, this is why it's particularly striking. We had, for example, the murder of Russian defector Maxim Kuzminov, the helicopter pilot who had basically joined the Ukrainians and then been resettled under a new identity in Spain. where he was unfortunately found and killed by, it seems to be, obviously this awaits a final resolution, but nonetheless it seems to have been organized crime, probably engaged by GU, Russian military intelligence, still widely known as GRU. But in particular, what's noteworthy is that it seems to have been the FSB, the Federal Security Service, largely domestic security agency, and one that is frankly much dirtier and much more closely connected to organized crime, that seems to have, shall we say, arranged the introductions. Now, why this matters is because certainly until February 2022, these agencies did not play well with one another. And the fact that we're now actually seeing increasing collaboration between the Russian intelligence agencies, particularly in their use of organized crime as an instrument, is an alarming sign. So we move on. March, arson in northeast London, in Leytonstone, 2 warehouses owned by Ukrainian business, which, amongst other things, had been involved in assembling humanitarian and other assistance for Ukraine. This again seems to have been a GU operation, and one carried out, though this time, just by just some local thugs, people who had no ideological or other sort of relationship with Russia, but just who were perfectly willing to burn down some warehouses for money. In May, we had a series of arrests in Poland of people associated with sort of this sabotage campaign. One can perhaps question a couple of these cases, whether they really sort of have the same kind of Russian connection or not. But in general terms, I mean, it is clear that they're actually speaking to a real threat and a real growing campaign. In Paris, we saw an attempted bomb attack. Fortunately, the person only blew himself up to a degree. But nonetheless, again, emphasizing the degree to which sabotage, direct physical sabotage, which once upon a time was something that the Russians would only do very carefully and with very specific goals, now seems to have become increasingly the norm. In July, it was revealed that there was an assassination plot against Armin Papega, the CEO of the arms firm Rheinmetall, who clearly had been a very sort of forceful advocate of support for Ukraine, wants to build a factory in Ukraine and such like. Now, again, this is also striking. Up to this point, the Russian state absolutely did reach out and try and kill people abroad. But on the other hand, it only really targeted those people whom it regarded as traitors. In other words, people who should have been loyal to the state, like defectors, double agents, or whoever. To actually go after a Westerner who had no reason to feel any kind of relationship with Moscow, that again was a sign of a continued shift in the rules of engagement for the Russian intelligence service. Then in August, we had the famous prisoner exchange, whereby we got back a series of people who could really only be described as hostages, journalists who've been doing their work, human rights activists and the like. And what did Putin get? He got Mr. Krasikov, the contract killer, the gangster contract killer turned FSB assassin who murdered Chechen Zelimkhan Kangoshvili in Berlin, and a series of other agents and criminals, including hackers. The degree to which the Russian state is now willing to put itself out to save these people, again, says something about the utility of even cyber criminals in its campaign. And we saw this reflected in the so-called hacktivist attacks on Latvia in September. So, all told, it is clear that there is something happening, something different, that we have a change in the way that Russia's intelligence community are operating, above all in Europe. For the moment, at least, or certainly until tomorrow, it seems to be that the United States is treated in a rather different way. And in particular, an aspect of that is the increasing use of organized crime and criminals of every kind as proxies. So what do I want to really sort of talk about? Well, firstly, obviously, that the threat from Russian and Russian-based organized crime groups and the financial flows that nurture them. The degree to which we're talking about a criminal phenomenon which has proved to be highly adaptive and entrepreneurial, which not only means it has an extraordinary, genuinely global network. I mean, I think short of Antarctica, there isn't a continent on which it's active. And frankly, even Antarctica wouldn't surprise me if we learned something new. But also it is adapted to the new environment in which it finds itself. And in particular, the Russian state's increasing interest to the point of demand for using it as a tool of statecraft. And this, for me, represents, as I say, a wider trend in an age of political war. I'll come on to that definition in a moment, that we have to be aware of, because it's not just about Russia, I think. So, first of all, who are the criminals we're talking about? Well, as I said, I mean, these are gangs which expanded very rapidly and effectively, especially, but not entirely, into Europe in the period since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, I'm talking about Russian-based organized crime here. And I think maybe I ought to perhaps sort of give a little definition. There are, I could spend an hour talking about different definitions of the beast: Eurasian organized crime, Russian organized crime, and so forth. I'm using Russian-based organized crime rather than just Russian organized crime, because we have to appreciate that, especially outside Russia, a lot of the gangs and networks we're talking about are not exclusively or even majority ethnic Russians. In many cases, they may well be Georgians or Armenians or mixes of all of them or whatever else. The key point is we're talking about groups whose center of gravity, shall we say, is still inside Russia. Maybe they have key assets there, or their leadership are still based in Russia. Maybe they depend on trades that move through Russia. But the main thing is this: because of that, they are therefore vulnerable. They're vulnerable to the Kremlin, reaching into their world and essentially saying, we know who you are, we know what you do. If you do not do what we want you to do, then you will be in trouble. Because this is the interesting thing. There are examples of ethnically Russian organized crime around the world, whether we're talking about New York's Brighton Beach neighborhood or wherever, which actually have rather tenuous links back to the motherland. And there's no real evidence that, in fact, they can be employed by the Kremlin in this way. So we're essentially talking about these gangs. And so, as I say, there are a lot of Georgians, a lot of Georgian organized crime figures fled Georgia when that country brought in some stringent new laws against their equivalent of the vori v zakoni, the thieves within the code, the sort of senior traditional leaders. And many of them fled and set up their operations inside Russia. And we now see elements of their networks active in Europe. There are many others. I'm not singling out the Georgians. So that's why it's Russian-based organized crime that I'm talking about. And as I say, it has spread dramatically. This is a map that's years old, but nonetheless, it does give a sense of the degree to which they have spread, including into Spain, despite the lack of a nice arrow. United Kingdom being in some ways a sort of an interesting exception. The kind of criminals that we welcomed were not so much your street gangster, but your rather more well-heeled oligarchs. But nonetheless, we're talking about a Europe-wide phenomenon. Highly adaptive and entrepreneurial. When the Russian gangs first crashed out of Russia at basically in the 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the new opportunities available to them, they very much saw themselves as potential conquerors, particularly in Eastern and Central Europe. And in they came in a flurry of dirty money and guns and tried to take over. And they failed in every single case. Mafias don't really migrate that way. They were pushed back by often an implicit, unspoken alliance between local states and local underworlds, neither of which wanted to see the Russians take over. So in the 2000s, they came back, but in another guise, not as conquistadors, but instead as merchant adventurers. And their offer was basically, what do you need? We can provide it. Whatever it is you need, whether it's drugs or women or guns or cybercrime services or money laundering or whatever else, we can provide it. And in this is actually how they worked so well. Because in a way, they set themselves up precisely as the facilitators of the existing gangs of Europe and beyond. And this certainly does apply to North America. So we may not see them on the streets, but nonetheless, if you look at the street activity, well, track that up. Let's say the heroin being trafficked on the street corner. Well, that's not being trafficked by a Russian, it's quite possibly just by a local criminal. But where might that heroin have been bought from? Well, in due course, it may well be that there's a Russian role. I mean, at peak before 2022, a quarter to a third, for example, of all heroin that was reaching Europe from Afghanistan was coming by the so-called northern route through Russia. And this can be said sort of in so many other ways, that they're operating at the strategic level rather than the street level. But they're involved in pretty much anything that one could actually sort of be involved in. So if we're talking traffickers of near enough anything, and you know, a lot of this is the sort of the heavy duty sort of crime things of heroin and such like, but it's also untaxed and counterfeit cigarettes and goods, and you name it. They're heavily involved in frauds and cyber crimes, and consequently all kinds of illicit financial activity, from capital flight out of Russia to laundering money, not just for Russians, but for everyone else. But as I say, in many cases, what they do is they then offer these services to the local gangs. And that's the essence of their network. That's what makes them so dangerous, is because their metaphorical little black book of contacts extends through so many different local gangs, whether it's sort of various Italian sort of crime gangs in the south, all the way through to outlaw motorcycle gangs in the north of Europe. And this has become activated precisely because of the close links between state business and crime in Russia, and a tradition of state dominance. So let me just turn now to why the state uses the criminals. There is, as I say, a deep history of the use of and connections with crime. We could go back to the Tsarist era and the Akhrana, the Tsarist secret police, and the degree to which, particularly abroad, you know, it used, amongst other assets, smugglers and the like, to keep tabs on revolutionaries. We could look at Stalin's era, in which criminals within the Gulag network were used to actually keep the political prisoners in line. We could look at the later Soviet era, the KGB recruiting prostitutes and pimps and black marketeers and money dealers as assets to watch and gather intelligence on foreign tourists and travelers, precisely with an aim of gathering compromising information, perhaps as with an eye to recruitment. So this is nothing particularly new. In essence, what's different is the scale. And the scale is to a large extent because the Kremlin essentially has, for years, increasingly been moving onto a wartime footing. And I think one can track this back, frankly, to 2011, 2012, a period of extraordinary protests in the streets of, above all, Moscow and St. Petersburg, protests against rigged elections and Putin's return to the presidency, which were a genuine, natural, organic response from a rising middle class that felt its voice was being ignored. To Putin, though, this was nothing of the sort. To Putin, he was convinced that it is the West, and above all the United States, that is the master of gibridnaya voyna, hybrid war, and that it was the West that had developed a pattern whereby, and he's looking at the Arab Spring and the so-called color revolutions inside post-Soviet Eurasia, the West was able to stir up risings to topple regimes that it didn't like. And these protests, the so-called Snow Revolution or the Bolotnaya protests, were a sign that the West was coming after him now. So again, in hindsight, I think that was the point when really, from that point, he's more and more convinced that he's on a war footing. And if you're on a war footing, then you obviously have a very different appetite for risk, a different perception of what is worth doing. And it built on a long Russian tradition, intelligence tradition of so-called active measures. In other words, your intelligence agencies are not there just simply to gather information to help your political leaderships reach good decisions, but also are actually there to carry out moves that will shape the world. An assassination here, a coup there, or whatever else. So you have intelligence services that are already used to this and geared towards this. And so over time, what we see in Russia is a mobilization state emerging. This is not North Korea. This is not Stalinist Russia. In other words, we're not talking about a system in which everything is controlled by the state. Yet it is a system in which the state feels it has the right to, at any point, reach out and metaphorically tap someone on the shoulder, an individual, a corporation, or indeed an organized crime grouping, and say, we need you to do this. And you know in those circumstances that out of whether it's your patriotic zeal or just simply the fact that you know the state will retaliate against you if you say no, this is an invitation that you can't refuse. And all this is mobilized into the pursuit of what I think it is useful to consider as political war, which is George Kennan's old phrase. George Kennan, the scholar diplomat who was really the architect of US Cold War policy towards the Soviet Union, described political war as the employment of all the means at a nation's command short of war, overt and covert, legal and illegal, psychological, economic, whatever. And to me, I think rather than hybrid war, I think actually political war gives a better sense of at least how the Russians see this, that they are not in a position in which they have any intention to actually start a shooting war with the West. But on the other hand, this provides them with a way or a different kind of conflict. And so this has evolved over time. Initially, actually, it was largely at home that the Russians used or tried to sort of control and constrain the organized crime world. And it was more proscriptive than prescriptive. In other words, it was more about telling the gangsters what they couldn't do than what that they should do. And two particularly classic examples are the Sochi Winter Olympics in 2014 and the Football World Cup in Russia in 2018. And in both of these cases, these were very much envisaged as soft power opportunities for the Kremlin. They wanted it to go well. They wanted the foreigners visiting to have a good experience. And that included not being ripped off or predated upon by the criminals. And so we saw pressure being brought to bear on the underworld. For example, there's one particular case in 2018 of a gang of notorious pickpockets in Moscow, in which the gang leader was picked up by the police and brought to a station for what they call a prophylactic chat, where they more or less suggested this would be a good time for him and his gang to go on a holiday. And he recognized an ultimatum, and indeed did. Nonetheless, though, there were, even from early days, individual cases where it is clear that the Russian intelligence community working for the Kremlin was willing to use organized crime as an instrument. 2007, massive cyber attacks on Estonia, many of those carried out by state apparatus, but nonetheless with a huge body of auxiliaries, including so-called patriotic hackers, many of whom were actually criminal hackers who were pressed into service to join the mass DDoS attacks on Estonian computer systems. 2011, we saw a series of assassinations of Chechen fundraisers and organizers supporting the rebel movement inside Russian-owned, held Chechnya, carried out in Istanbul. And in one particular case, for example, it is clear that essentially it was a gang of car thieves from Moscow who had never traveled to Istanbul before and presumably now will never travel to Istanbul again, who just simply flew in, carried out the hit, and flew back. Why? Was there any kind of bad blood between them? Not at all. It's actually clear that they were engaged by the FSB to carry out this attack. Christopher Metsos in 2010, probably the only member of the so-called illegals, deep cover Russian intelligence agents in the United States, who actually had any kind of real intelligence value, managed to get away to Cyprus. Arrested, bailed, still being watched though, disappeared from view. Was that because the Russian intelligence community extracted him? Not directly. They didn't really have much of an asset base within Cyprus at that time, certainly not the right asset base. It seems to have been actually people traffickers. In other words, people who are criminals who are specialists at getting someone across the border without the state knowing, who took Metsos to Greece, where he could be exfiltrated by the SVR, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. So there are individual cases, but nothing to suggest anything like a campaign. It's really from 2014 that we begin to see this actually sort of emerging much more. Intelligence gathering, hacking attacks, some particular cases of violence, the use of criminals to raise so-called chornaya kassa, black account monies. As it becomes harder and harder for the Kremlin to move monies to provide operational funds for intelligence operations, supporting disinformation campaigns and political actors and the like in the West, they need to find ways of essentially gathering funds that do not have Kremlin fingerprints on them. One way of doing so is precisely to, in effect, tax Russian-based organized crime gangs operating abroad. More or less say, look, we know what you're doing. We expect you to send this certain amount of money to this particular bank account, this PayPal account, or whatever else. So in other words, this is money that doesn't have any kind of direct connection to the Russian state, which then can be tapped by the Russian intelligence apparatus. And more broadly, we have these pseudo-states created by the Russians in the Donbass region of Ukraine, the Lugansk and Donetsk, rather, people's republics, which, because they need to be subsidized because they're not in any way working states, well, in order to defray the costs, beyond just simply direct subsidies from Moscow, we actually have the massive use of organized criminality. Everything from coal smuggling to counterfeit cigarette trafficking, being used to basically keep the economies of these pseudo-states afloat. And the report that I co-wrote for the Global Initiative, Rebellion as Racket, is available for free on the GI website. But of course, it's now very different, not least because as far as Putin is concerned, he is at war with the West. I mean, call what's going on in Ukraine a war in Russia, and you face the risk of a prison sentence. But on the other hand, the wider conflict with the West, of which, as far as Putin is concerned, Ukraine is just one front, one theater, well, that's clearly described as a war. Putin himself, in 2023 Victory Day address, said that civilization is at a crucial turning point. A real war is being waged against our country again. So, again, the usual constraints which one might find are pretty much gone. But given that he finds himself in a struggle with a political bloc, NATO, European Union, and the West more broadly, which is clearly vastly more powerful on pretty much any index: military power, political power, economic power for certain, soft power. But its vulnerability is precisely that it's a constellation of democracies with all the ensuing divisions within and between its countries. That's where we have the focus of Russian asymmetric operations. And in addition, at the beginning of the invasion, there was this massive campaign of expulsions of Russian intelligence officers working under diplomatic cover. And this was highly successful and very important and worth doing. However, where I think we may have failed is not really trying to think through what are the likely implications when a collection of, we have to recognize, competent, imaginative, morally bankrupt individuals on the other side. What are they going to do in response? Well, one of the answers is precisely that they have moved increasingly to proxies. So, we're talking about, yes, sometimes it's people with an ideological commitment to the Russian cause, or rather an ideological problem with the West. Sometimes it is indeed members of the Russian diaspora. Sometimes it's just simply disturbed individuals, but it is also criminals, organized crime, and indeed petty criminals who are being engaged increasingly as proxies for the furthering of Russia's goals. And these include, obviously, sanctions busting, seeing what necessary goods can be smuggled across there, the illegal financial flows that allows Russia to continue to operate in global markets, but also, absolutely crucially, direct action. To what end? I mean, there's a site of a shopping mall apparently was torched by Russian agents. Well, in part, this is signaling. Things could get much, much worse for you. If you continue to support Ukraine, if you continue to treat us in this unfair way, trying to deny us our great power status and, as Putin sees it, our rightful claims, then bad things will happen. It's about actual physical disruption. See, so many of the attacks, they may look trivial, pointless almost. Burning a shopping mall, or launching a cyber attack on railway ticketing systems, or whatever else. What's the big deal? Supporting a ransomware attack on the British National Health Service. These are not sort of grand war-winning approaches. But the whole point is, I think we're seeing a campaign of what I'm calling the weaponization of inconvenience, an attempt precisely to try and create myriad minor degrading attacks that affect Western life, precisely to the point of making us begin to think twice about our continued support for Ukraine. But of course, the constant risk of that is how might that escalate? So what are the trends that we're seeing? Well, as I say, I think we're seeing continued flows of business and money proving to be very supple and responsive to sanctions. It's very hard to strangle it off. We're seeing the Kremlin using crime whenever it seems to make sense the gangsters are not the Kremlin's tool of choice. It would rather rely on its intelligence services. But with its intelligence services, certainly their human networks abroad heavily degraded, and more to the point, with a whole series of new and additional missions being placed upon them, they need extra capacity. And criminals are amongst those individuals that they will turn to. And the criminals, well, frankly, dealing with them is less of a problem now. The Kremlin feels under fewer external constraints now that it is in effect at war. And as far as Putin is concerned, this is an existential struggle for him, at least, if not Russia. And as the Ukrainians continue to launch attacks, which one could describe as terrorist style, I mean, I wouldn't want to characterize them as terrorist, within Russia, we're not just seeing drone and missile attacks, but also, arson attacks on draft offices and the like, as well as assassinations of particularly outspoken cheerleaders for the war. Well, remember, Putin doesn't really believe Ukraine exists as a country. He certainly doesn't really believe that the Ukrainians have agency. And as far as he's concerned, in his rather colonial view of the world, the Ukrainians would not be doing that without Western approval, or indeed, if not at Western instigation. And therefore, as a result, there is a sense that in some ways, the West is getting a taste of its own medicine. So there seems to be a decision that was made somewhere around the middle of 2023. If one looks at the operations which have been taking place this year, it is clear that they in most cases they seem to date back to late 2023. And as a result, again, I think this is not just simply a brief pulse. This is actually something that we can expect to see happening. That this is in some ways depressing that the thought is the new normal. Because even if the war in Ukraine ends soon, which it shows no sign of doing so, alas, we will continue to have a problem with Putin thereafter. Remember, Putin does not think this is primarily about Ukraine. He regards Ukraine as one aspect of a wider campaign he faces from the West. I wouldn't agree with him, but nonetheless, we have to accept that that's his view. So what are we seeing? Well, we are seeing growing use of them for sanctions busting. Most sanctions busting is not done by organized crime. It is being done by a variety of sort of shady entrepreneurs who export goods to one country and then sort of actually then rotate it and then re-export it to Russia. But nonetheless, organized crime clearly is used in a variety of sanctions busting roles, and in particular has realized that this is actually an advantage. I remember talking to one figure close to the Russian security apparatus, who admitted that basically, gangs that are smuggling stuff out of Russia, there is still drugs and other goods being moved westwards. In some ways, if they are returning with some kind of material that is advantageous to the Russian state, in other words, that is breaking sanctions, they basically get a free pass across the Russian border. So you can essentially buy a degree of impunity for yourself by engaging on the side with some sanctions busting while you're still carrying out your criminal activities. We're seeing that criminals being used to a degree as espionage assets, carrying out low-level surveillance of the sort that it's actually very hard to do now that as your intelligence agency, you've lost so many of your warm bodies on the ground. We're obviously seeing massive use of hackers as cyber assets. And in some cases, this is specific and directed. We want you to do X. But in other cases, it is just simply clear that if you are attacking West and stealing from the West and carrying out your ransomware attacks and so forth, you will face no trouble inside Russia. The authorities are not going to investigate you. You certainly aren't going to be extradited or anything like that. After all, there's pretty much no law enforcement cooperation these days. So, it is clear that there is both directive and just simply encouraged because of the impunity to be provided. And then there's some more direct kind of political war operations we've seen, weaponized migration, particularly, so I think more striking sort of than in the Belarusian case, we saw weaponized migration, which is much more run all the way down the line by the Belarusian security apparatus. When the Russians did it, it's more that they just simply brought existing people smugglers into the business and more or less provided them with opportunities. We see them being used, as I've already mentioned, for sabotage and assassination missions. And I think, unfortunately, that will become a growing issue. and also for information operations. I mean, we had the case, for example, there in the picture in the slide of some nasty graffiti that was placed on Jewish memorials in France. Now, some of these attacks clearly are carried out by people of politically extreme views. In other cases, though, it just seems to be low lives who are recruited online, offered often almost insultingly small amounts of money that they're still happy to do in order to carry out these attacks, precisely to kind of create a growing climate of insecurity and uncertainty and even interethnic hostility within the West. So what should we do? Now, I should stress that I'm cantering through the body of the report. I would encourage you, if you're interested, to read the report, because I go into a lot more detail, both into the problem and the recommendations in that. But very briefly put, first of all, naming the beast. Let's actually be open about this. I think we have to talk more about this. I'm very glad that actually we are getting more and more recognition of the challenge. For example, Ken McCallan, Director General of MI5, Britain's Security Service, recently talking about Russian state actors turning to proxies for their dirty work, including private intelligence operatives and criminals. So, I mean, I think this is important because one has to start by recognizing the challenge in order to unlock further policy action. We have to bridge the police intelligence gap. A lot of talk always made about the importance of intelligence sharing. In practice, this is still a problem. This still doesn't work very well in most countries. That's something that needs to be done, along with expanding the knowledge base on the threat we face, which is precisely what we're doing now. We have to recognize that this is just as important as military security in terms of protecting our societies, the integrity of our democratic systems, and so forth. And that does mean inevitably that while we're talking about spending more money on tanks and planes and aircraft carriers, we also need to be thinking about the necessary resources for policing and for counterintelligence, particularly counterintelligence. There is a huge disparity within the West between how seriously governments fund counterintelligence. And that's something that needs to be addressed. And I would suggest, because otherwise it represents a weakness within the alliances. And that means obviously also greater cooperation, though cooperation is sometimes used as too easy a nostrum to sort of sort every problem out. We need to look at the Russian diaspora. It's very easy to see them as a potential threat. And absolutely, amongst them, there will be people who are Russian agents, who may become Russian agents, or just generally who are feeling alienated in the West and are vulnerable to Russian recruitment. But on the other hand, most of them are not. The overwhelming majority are not. And in fact, these are also people who can be used very usefully as allies of Western societies. You know, if one thinks of, for example, the order of magnitude of difference that it made for policing Italian organized crime within New York, when at the beginning of the 20th century, the New York police began to actually recruit ethnically Italian officers. You know, generally, I think we need to be thinking much more about how we can creatively build bridges with the diaspora to gather intelligence about what's going on, to block off, hopefully, their recruitment, but also because actually there are people who we might want to recruit into our security and intelligence agencies. Yes, it comes with risks, no question about that, but it also comes with huge opportunities. And finally, on the recommendations, yes, we need to come up with proper responses which I think, you know, realistically speaking, are going to focus on disruption more than just simply the kind of classic happy ending of people ending up in the dock and then being sent to prison for their crimes. You know, we're talking about often exceedingly complex criminal networks that do not involve themselves on a street level, that can afford the best money launderers, the best lawyers, and such like. So, you know, they just recognize that actually in operations which may not lead to arrests, but nonetheless disrupt activities, that's still a win. We need to think more carefully about how we can actually counterattack, particularly against cyber criminals. You know, if they're being used as proxies of the state, but they're not actually state actors, then I think we can, without risking greater escalation, think about ways in which we can strike back in the virtual realm against them. We need to be more aggressively go after the money, of course, because after all, the criminals are doing what they're doing at the moment because there's very few risks involved in agreeing to do what the Kremlin demands from you. because on the whole, we play by the rules, the Kremlin does not. Well, we still have to play by the rules, but we have to think more creatively about how we can use those rules, particularly in order to target their money, and through so-called prophylactic chats, this very Russian approach whereby people are called in and just more or less told, we know what you're doing, we'd like you to stop. And you now know that you're on our radar and we're watching. Again, I think a lot of these organized crime groups, what they're doing is because at present, they don't really think that we take what they're doing seriously, but they know the Kremlin is very serious. We need to communicate seriousness to try and deter them. Because after all, to conclude, we do face all kinds of potential nightmares if this continues to escalate. The thought of proxies, people who are recruited online, they don't necessarily know for sure who's recruiting them. And my big concern is increasingly we're going to find non-Russian criminals or not even Russian-based organized crime network members being recruited through various contacts who are not Russian themselves, have no connection with Russia, and don't even know they're working for Russia. It's going to be very hard to actually track, let alone deter them. The risk that this goes transatlantic, again, I think much will depend on what happens in the forthcoming American elections. And certainly if we see a Harris presidency, it's possible, I'd say no more than possible, that the Russians will decide there's no reason to hold back and that they also want to extend their disruptive activities more directly on the ground there. And the thought that Russia may well find itself copying North Korea and in effect nationalize much of its criminals. Bureau 39 is in effect North Korea's Ministry of Organized Crime, involved in everything from producing and smuggling methamphetamines to massive insurance frauds. Well, if the Russian state increasingly actually brought organized crime within the orbit of its intelligence community, we would face a much more formidable challenge. But of course, this also has threats for Russia. The Donbassization, we're already seeing a massive increase in violent and organized crime. Organized crime rates, for example, have doubled since February 2022. That's quite a sort of dramatic increase. So, we may well see Russia actually, because of its use of criminality, increasingly sliding into a 90s style disorder. And we may well find that the Ukrainians will seek to actually use organized crime within Russia as a tool against them. So I think we have to acknowledge the degree to which this has a massive disruptive capacity all round. And this is why I'm so glad that I have had a chance to write this report, however downbeat and depressing it may have been, because precisely it's about trying to encourage and deepen the nature of the conversation now, so we can address it while it's still a relatively new, relatively scattered, and relatively experimental technique. I mean, I think the Russians are still feeling out, trying to work out, what works and what doesn't, rather than waiting until it really has become an entrenched and, shall we say, professionalized problem. Anyway, thanks very much. That is, as I say, a rather breathless canter through the essence of my report. And now very happy to throw it open to questions and comments that I think Tuesday will be handling.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, as always, for an excellent presentation and an astonishing breadth of knowledge and much food for thought. I'm going to try and pull together some of the questions that are coming in the Q&A page, and anybody else who's online, we do have 15 minutes for questions. So if you have more, please do drop them in now. I will, taking your last point, as you concluded, which you said, let's get to grips with this as a relatively new phenomena. It seems like a number of our colleagues in the chat will dispute whether or not that's a new phenomena, with some saying, of course, very long routes, some learning from US practices elsewhere, or something that has been going on or building since the 90s. The genesis of the question seems to be, first of all, has something strategic changed? Can you come back to that? And is the fact that we failed to name it our greatest weakness?
I mean, something has changed, absolutely, in that precisely from Putin's point of view, he feels he has no reason to, as it were, hold back. Certainly until 2022, there was a concern about what we might think of as political escalation on the part of the West. And yes, of course, this has long historical antecedents, and the Soviet and then Russian intelligence services absolutely did. And yes, they are not the only people ever to have used criminals as instruments of statecraft. Of course not. But I think what we are seeing, as I said, particularly since late of last year, is actually the difference between using them as, shall we say, an occasional adjunct when you discover that you have some particular lack of operational capacity. You need to do X, and you quite haven't got the skills or the warm bodies in order to do it, into much more of a more sort of thoughtful campaign to use these for a variety of attacks, which are often opportunistic and just driven by, whom you can recruit and what they can do to disrupt, well, at the moment Europe's, but potentially the West. So I think that's what we're seeing. I think it's the degree to which we are seeing the criminals seen as a sort of a central element of Russia's campaign, rather than just an occasional, when necessary, sort of instrument. And I mean, is the biggest weakness the failure to name it? Well, look, failure to name it is not in and of itself that important. It's important, though, in that what it unlocks. It unlocks, first of all, the opportunity for a public debate. And again, I mean, I think that's going to be necessary because, we have to recognize that whatever we do, we will never be able to actually stop attacks from happening of this sort. It's like terrorism. Some attacks will always get through. And having a public debate about what's going on is going to be necessary to build the public resilience, so that we don't then panic when a shopping mall goes up in flames or we can't get to work because the trains aren't working. But also that the public sort of recognition is important for then unlocking the resources and the opportunities for cooperation within states and such like. So I see it more as opening a door rather than a sort of a thing in and of itself. And certainly until we properly admit it, you can't really get through that doorway.
Thank you. So grouping another couple of questions, perhaps unfairly to the questioners, because I must say our questioners are also extremely articulate. Looking at the issue of responses, some ask, first of all, does this mean can we get together consensus to tackle the crime in order to suppress the actions of the state? Similarly, any suggestions on how to respond to disinformation or sort of propaganda style publications, not from Russia and others, where they're repeatedly making false statements, but we lack ways to challenge it? And then thirdly, what do you see as the role of law enforcement in this specifically, and what would they need to do to be effective?
Okay, I mean, great questions, which frankly I could spend another hour easily talking to, but I will try not to. Getting sort of consensus on the sort of structures to actually suppress crime. I mean, the real problem here is precisely what the Russians do is the Russians' role as, in some ways, the sort of facilitators and service providers to a lot of gangs mean that it's actually quite hard to kind of get at them. And I think that what we have to appreciate is the degree to which we will sometimes be able to suppress these activities, but often actually our goal will have to be to deter them. And in classic deterrence theory, you deter by punishment or you deter by denial. We can never necessarily be more intimidating than the Kremlin. Particularly, this is why the importance of Russian-based organized crime groups. If actually someone is sitting there in Moscow and knows that they can't now leave Moscow if the security apparatus denies it, and they're faced with an ultimatum, they will be perfectly willing to deploy whatever resources necessary because they don't want to find themselves in an Arctic labor camp. On the other hand, deterrence by denial is really important. Is actually, if we focus on this and we realize that Russian-based organized crime is not a law enforcement but a wider security issue, then actually it becomes quite possibly much less encouraging and effective for the Kremlin to try and intimidate these people into carrying out certain acts. So I think it's about slowly making this less appealing for the Kremlin rather than anything else. How do we respond to disinformation? Well, this is not really an organized crime issue, I have to say. And again, I mean, it's a really important one. But disinformation is largely coming from media outlets, from various social media sites and such like. And there's a whole debate on how to respond properly to that. In part, I think we do have to address the degree to which we have failed to give enough people reason to actually believe their governments, their official leaders, and such like. That's one of the fundamental problems. Where organized crime does come in, though, is precisely that what it can do is it can provide sort of activities on the ground that then either provide grist to the disinformation mills or seem to justify it. It's all very well my sort of, if I was putting out claims about, for example, the massive level of anti-Semitism in the West, that is actually dramatically assisted if I can also get people to graffiti and vandalize Jewish memorials and the like. And this is clearly what was happening in Paris. So I think what we can see is that these activities sort of act as force multipliers for disinformation. Role of law enforcement, obviously sort of absolutely crucial as a sort of the front line. But I go to this point about the extent to which we have to acknowledge that often disruption is going to be the most important thing. One of the key issues is law enforcement often finds itself in a politically very unforgiving environment in which it's basically not allowed to fail. They are constantly being assessed by their capacity to keep the streets safe, but in particular to actually catch people, bring successful prosecutions, and put people in prison. And I've spoken to law enforcers here in the UK and elsewhere who acknowledge that actually investigating these Russian-based organized crime networks is incredibly complex and difficult and resource intensive, and quite likely will not lead to arrests and the other kind of formal indications of success. And I think we have to acknowledge that we are putting them in a position where otherwise the temptation is we're almost pressurizing them to go after the low-lying fruit. The heroin pusher who's taking up position just outside a school. Sure, that's a very important person to go after. But on the other hand, actually going after a Russian-based organized crime group, knowing that you're probably not going to actually be able to take a prosecution forward, but still creating sufficient disruption to its activities that it is no longer able to operate in anything like the same sort of way, that is still, in my opinion, very much a win. And that's exactly the kind of thing law enforcement can do, but it has to be allowed to do so without being penalized for spending all these resources without a clear and specific success as a result.
Thank you. Okay, because a set of questions connected together that aren't really together, but I'm going to let you answer them all in one anyway. So a couple of questions ask essentially about the spectrum of proximity between the Russian state and criminality. So firstly, can we distinguish between organized crime by the Russian government itself versus what is arm's length distance crime? Is it fair to call Russia a mafia state? Secondly, are they using these instruments of criminality as domestically at home as well as abroad? And then third, who do you see as the most likely to copy the Russian playbook in this area?
Proximity of the Russian state. Look, I really don't like this phrase mafia state, because it very much implies that the Kremlin runs the gangs, or alternatively, the organized crime runs the Kremlin. Look, Russia is a kleptocracy, and it is ruled by a series of deeply corrupt individuals. But that's not quite the same as organized crime. And obviously, there's a danger of getting too lost in the sort of semantics of definitions of organized crime. And look, Putin, back in the 1990s, did he deal with organized crime? Absolutely, back when he was deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. Does he now? Of course not. He operates on a sort of a vastly higher level. The Russian state is in many ways the biggest gang in town, but it is operating on a different level from the gangs. Take, for example, again, go back to the Sochi Winter Olympics. There was huge amounts of embezzlement, huge amounts of corruption in the whole procurement process to build the Olympic Village and everything else. You had contracts going out to Putin's friends and cronies, people like the Rotenberg brothers, who are sort of, amongst the many beneficiaries of his largesse, and going down through various subcontracting. And at some point, it trickled down to the point where organized crime was directly involved, whether it was in terms of, gang mastering, essentially semi-slave labor from Central Asia to carry out the building, in terms of leverage buyouts of land, all of this. But the point is, it was at many levels removed from the political leadership itself. So, I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that Russia is a corrupt kleptocracy, but organized crime operates separately. And indeed, we have a constant tally of organized crime figures who are arrested and tried in Russia. There are still police officers trying to do their job. There are still judges trying to do their jobs. Is organized crime being used domestically? Not really, because there, you have a massive security apparatus to essentially do whatever needs to be done. There aren't any of the kind of constraints abroad. If anything, what one actually gets is just simply it's essentially taxed by the kleptocracy. Who do I think is most likely to sort of copy the Russian example? Well, I mean, we should note, for example, that China already has strong links, with particularly the sort of triads and other criminal groupings. When Hong Kong returned to Beijing's control, Beijing explicitly reached out and said to the triads, many of whom had been thinking of having to flee, that it was very happy to keep the so-called patriotic triads in place. And since then, we have seen various evidence of cooperation. So the Chinese might well see further ways of weaponizing this. I think more broadly, though, this is a kind of it's a poor man's instrument, in the sense of it's precisely useful for revisionist countries that are already pariahs and yet have substantial international networks. I mean, Iran, for example, has, we have seen the use of criminals by the Iranian regime. Now, it has been much less of a thing because on the whole, they are used as part of campaigns against specifically, Iranian expat and emigre political opposition to Tehran or whatever. But it means that, for example, there are links through the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to a whole variety of criminal actors in the Middle East in particular, but also, for example, in the Balkans, which could be pushed further. So again, I mean, I think it is of a particular appeal to pariah states that are already heavily connected to transnational criminal connections. In Latin America, for example, Venezuela as well.
Thank you. That very much for us reinforces our geocriminality definition, which is states. We find that there's an interconnection between states that are strong at home, but then constrained or weakened abroad. So they're looking for alternative ways to project their influence. Okay, one last question, and perhaps not such a difficult one, which will give you the last 90 seconds to respond to it. What do you see as the potential for organized crime facilitating transnational money flows, raising resources, moving them, anything else?
Yeah, look, I mean, the thing is that organized crime depends on its capacity to exploit, develop, and expand illegal financial flows. And as certain routes get closed, they find it quite easy to open other ones. So, I mean, I think, just simply the presence of organized crime, and not just Russian organized crime, ensures that there are these various routes that the Russians use. I mean, if one looks at, for example, we know certain routes through the Middle East that were not necessarily developed by the Russians, but which have been absolutely exploited by them, in particular in connection with their own activities in Africa. So I think it's more that, unfortunately, the presence of a global, interconnected, modern 21st century underworld creates a variety of services and conduits that the Russians can take advantage of. And as a result, it's actually going to be really hard to clamp down on them. This really, I think, does demonstrate, unfortunately, some of the limits of, certainly in the 21st century, the global legal order.
Thank you, Mark. We'll leave it with the global criminal underworld then. And a very big thank you to you for joining us today and for the excellent report. It is now live on our website, so anybody who would like to grab it and read it, please do. And if you have any follow-up questions, of course, we would be thrilled to hear from you by email. Many thanks again. Also, if you're interested in the issue of geocriminality, last week we published a report on Iran's use of organized crime for their state ends. So an opportunity to do some comparing and contrasting for yourselves. Any other follow-up? Of course, we're always here. So many thanks to the 100 and something people who joined us today. Mark, as usual, your star power pulls them in. And we look forward to seeing you all at future Global Initiative events. Many thanks.